that she had. Everyone would like to take a seat, then we can get going. It's a very exciting evening.
The sooner we start,
the less Aperol Anand and I have drunk, and that's probably going to make for a better conversation. Stop drinking. Stop drinking.
They're strong, aren't they? Go on.
Joe. Hello, everybody, and good evening to this UK in a Changing Europe event. Welcome to our celebration of 10 years of UK in a Changing Europe. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a senior research fellow here, and it's just so exciting that today is the day when I finally get to turn the tables. Lots of us have been here to hear Anand chatting away, interrogating Jacob Rees-Mogg, Caroline Lucas, Michael Gove, whoever, Lisa Nandy, all those people. But today, finally, we get to turn the tables and ask lots and lots and lots of questions. Anand's already said he thinks my script looks very daunting. Anyway, so we're going to ask him. We're going to talk to Anand. I'm going to ask him some questions. You're going to get to ask him some questions. People on Slido are going to get him to answer some questions, and we'll be done by about midnight. Anyway, so let's get going. Anand, we're going to move to talk on about the current state of UK-EU relations, what the UK needs to do and survive and thrive in a changing Europe. And maybe Europe's not the total sum of our problems at the moment, but I wanted to go back to the start. So, why did a kid from Wakefield out of Kerala decide to devote their life's work to understanding the way the EU worked?
God, it wasn't as rational.
It's supposed to be easy.
It wasn't as rational or as clear as that. I started off actually way back when. I did my PhD in 1992, and it was on French foreign policy. And then I got a job, because this is how academia used to work, teaching EU politics, even though I didn't really know what the EU was. So I learnt about it, and the rest, as they say, is history. Until this, I'd spent 20-odd years writing about, teaching about the European Union, and then suddenly, which we might talk about, the SLC had this idea about the UK and a changing Europe, and I suddenly had to learn more than I ever wanted to about British politics.
So I'm not going to admit to you that actually when I left university, my first choice thing was to go and study the political economy of the EU. But actually, I took my second choice, which was to go to the Treasury. But anyway, and lost to academia forever. But it's quite interesting you saying that you went to teach EU politics despite the fact you didn't know anything about it. Is that a general sign of a lack of academic interest in the EU?
God, no, not back then. If you think back to 1992, it was single market. In fact, I think 1992 was the year when the winning song in the Eurovision Song Contest was about the single market. I kid you not. It was around then in the early 1990s. I mean, Europe was a big thing in the early 1990s. I mean, it's quite hard to imagine now, but there'd suddenly been this enormous awakening of interest after the Single European Act. You'd had a flurry of mergers and acquisitions across European borders. Europe, I think, it is probably the case that Europe was more popular than it had ever been by the early 1990s. So it was a growth industry. And one of the reasons I got the job was because Oxford, like so many other universities, were desperately opening up European studies programs to try and tap into this growing interest.
And what was the song?
Oh, I don't know. It was an Italian one, I think. If someone can Google it, I'm sure I'm right.
Don't worry, I'll ask Jess Sargent later. She'll know. She'll definitely know that. And if she doesn't, she'll know it by the end of the thing. So when you started on this, were you prescient enough to think the UK at some point is going to have a referendum fall out of love with the EU, and this will offer me an unparalleled opportunity to get myself on the news quiz.
I mean, anyone who's at all familiar with our work will know that insofar as I ever make predictions, they're always wrong. So, no. I did spend a bit of my career writing about what was even then a paradox, which was that the UK was the most dissatisfied member state, whilst also being arguably the most effective and successful member state. So we did write about that tension between the fact that, you know, by the early 90s, the European Union was a very British place. And I remember the French permanent representative to the European Union telling me in the early 1990s that we had a Europe anglo-saxon, which was a bad thing, apparently. And there was always that paradox about us, that we moaned about it a lot, and yet other countries looked at us as one of the leading shapers of it.
So you weren't sort of thinking, this is, you know, we'd already had Maastricht by about then, negotiated by John Major,
I think
UK opting out, other countries going towards a single currency, UK saying, not sure, we'd crashed out of the ERM, you know, we'd had that fresh start letter, the Danish referendum, the beginning of the Tory moves of Euroscepticism. You weren't thinking, you know, this is going to end in...
Maybe by the time of Lisbon, because of course Tony Blair and David Cameron promised referendums on the Lisbon Treaty. I think I'm right in saying the Lib Dems went into the 2010 election with the promise of a referendum on Europe, and they were the first party to do it. So there was obviously a head of steam building by the early part of this century. But back in the 1990s, absolutely not. Back in the 1990s, James Goldsmith and his party were very fringe. You know, the precursors to UKIP were polling in the sort of single digits, low single digits. It never looked like exploding in the way it did. And let's face it, the only reason I think it really exploded the way it did was because, and you know, this was Nigel Farage's signal achievement, wasn't it? He linked an issue that mattered to the British public, immigration, to an issue that didn't matter to the British public particularly, which was the EU. And by linking them, he made the EU far more salient in our politics than it had been.
But didn't become salient until migration numbers started going up dramatically with the accession in 2004?
No, it happened gradually. There's a wonderful blog on our website from about 2017 where I think it's Jeff Evans. There are two graphs. There's a graph of immigration numbers and there's a graph of public concern about immigration, and they go exactly in parallel. So concern about it rose as the numbers rose, but then Farage did his trick of linking that to EU membership, which happened later.
And did you think then, was there any stage at which you thought a referendum's becoming inevitable? We've had lots of debates, haven't we, in the Brexit Witness Archive between people who are in that sort of Cameron circles of whether Cameron really would have to concede a referendum at some point or whether it was just a horrendous tactical error for him to do so. Did you ever think the UK actually is going to end up with a referendum on this?
I think by the time of the coalition government looking at the state of the Conservative Party and looking at the scale of rebellions about Europe, it became clear that something would have to give, given the nature of the Conservative Party. I didn't expect it to happen in 2013. I didn't expect him to call for a referendum then. But I think most people who watch these things thought it's going to become increasing. The more that politicians pledge a referendum and don't deliver it, the harder it becomes to not deliver it eventually.
And once that loomed on the horizon, how did UKIS come about? Give us the origin story of UK in a changing Europe for those of us that weren't there at the birth.
I mean, everyone who works with me will realise that I struggle to remember yesterday, so this is a bit of a strain. Well, I mean, the decision to create UK in a changing Europe was a decision taken by the ESRC. It wasn't a decision taken by me, and it was based on the fact that during the Scottish referendum, they'd set up a little unit at the University of Edinburgh to do what essentially UK in a Changing Europe was set up to do, to provide research-based evidence about what was at stake in the Scottish referendum. And that worked quite well. And so at the tail end of 2014, when, still no one thought there was going to be a referendum because no one thought the Tories were going to win, they set up UK in a Changing Europe with a tiny budget as a scoping exercise to look at the debate in the academic literature about EU membership. Of course, from the moment of the general election of 2015, which was the day we hired our first member of staff, that debate changed fundamentally. When the Tories came back in with the majority, all of a sudden it was panic stations, there's going to be a referendum.
So we've got panic stations referendum. So give us some highlights of the referendum campaign for you. What were UKIS's top moments?
Well, one of my top moments was we were in Spalding, which is in Lincolnshire. During the referendum, we did loads of public events. And I was on the panel and Jonathan Portes was on the panel. And Jonathan did his spiel about immigration and its net positive impact on the UK economy. And this woman stood up. It was so funny, because Jonathan was for the first and only time speechless, and said, "It's all right for you don't bloody live here. Try getting a doctor's appointment in the summer when the population of this town trebles." And Jonathan's face was a picture. I don't know if Jonathan's here, but I hope he sees the recording. That was a standout moment. I mean, we had lots of standout moments with the general public, actually, during, that whole Your Bloody GDP thing happened in a pub in Newcastle about 10 days before the referendum. So we did I think we must have done about 12 or 15 public events around the country in the run-up to the referendum. And what was brilliant and bizarre was, A, the rooms were always packed, right? Even in places where you didn't think people would have any interest at all in this. B, quite often on the train there or in the pub beforehand, you'd hear people talking about the referendum. I mean, people were genuinely interested in politics and the referendum, which I thought was fantastic. And people used to turn up and ask questions. I mean, it was a really, really interesting and fun time, actually.
And we asked lots of leading lights of the sort of Brexit campaigns, when did they realise that Remain might not win, that Leave could win this? When did you start to think, actually, the government might end up having made a massive mistake here and Leave could win it?
I mean, I was never that prescient. I think about a week before the referendum, I was pretty convinced that there could be a majority for Leave, but I thought Remain would win, so I got it totally wrong. But the reason I thought that was because we spent a lot of time in the north of England with a lot of people who said they wanted to vote Leave, but people who didn't vote. So my assumption was there is a huge number of people out there who would vote Leave, but they don't tend to vote. They might not be registered. I mean, as it turned out, I think 2.8 million people who didn't vote in the 2015 election and chose to abstain voted in the EU referendum. And I think a significant proportion of those 2.8 million were Leave voters who'd actually opted out of national politics. One of the biggest ironies for me of the referendum is, so the Leave campaign, the chief executive was a guy called Matthew Elliott. Matthew Elliott in 2011 had run the No to AV campaign, in which he'd argued that our electoral system is fantastic, there's no need to change it. In the 2 weeks running up to the EU referendum, his Leave campaign was sending out texts to supporters saying, "This is the only election in which your vote will count, because it doesn't in our elections because of our first past the post system." And I always thought that was quite ironic, but I think it was quite effective in getting people out. The idea that, there is no such thing as a safe seat in a national referendum.
Very interesting, very interesting. So tell us about referendum. I'm going to stop dwelling on the referendum and do a bit of post-batch analysis on that. But we've asked all the people in our Brexit Witness archive, where were you on the night of the referendum? How did you feel? What did you do the next day? So where were you on the night of the referendum?
Well, I felt really hacked off because I spent the whole night of the referendum at ITV Studios and they never once had me on. So I felt quite bitter and twisted by about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. So we watched it there. When they came up on the screen, because ITV were ahead of the BBC that night, for those of you who were watching, because they did this percentage chance of a Leave vote. And so ITV kind of called it a little bit earlier than the BBC, who are a little bit cagier. Then I walked to College Green about 4:30 in the morning. I bumped into Nigel Farage and his extremely drunk bunch of exclusively blokes, all wearing cravats, which I remember very, very clearly indeed. That was slightly strange. And then we went into a morning of media, and my highlight of that morning, which I will always remember, is I was standing outside the 5 Live radio tent, and Catherine Barnard was in there doing an interview, and she was sat next to Jeremy Corbyn. And that was the interview where Jeremy Corbyn said, "Yeah, we might as well just trigger Article 50 this morning." And Catherine's face, this look of pure, undiluted horror on her face, will stick with me.
And did she put him right?
No. She just went puce.
So apart from going puce, UKIS was set up to make sure academic evidence, research, knowledge about the EU, about the UK, played a role in the referendum. Did it?
To a limited extent, I think. I mean, in retrospect, we were nowhere near as well known in 2016 as we became subsequently, which is one of my great regrets. I think we made a big difference with the audiences we talked to directly, but that's obviously a limited number of people. We did little bits of media stuff during the referendum. I think our impact and our ability to sort of disseminate that research was significantly greater after the referendum than it was during it.
Okay, well, let's roll forward. We've got those long years of Brexit negotiations.
Golden days, as we call them.
Good for business. Which is sort of slightly reminiscent, actually, of watching Rory McIlroy's final round at the Masters, where you sort of think you've got it and then you throw it away again and whatever. Anyway, I don't want to relive those in glorious technicolor.
So I take the drink off her.
But you and I wrote a piece called "Who Killed Soft Brexit?" So for which we got universally pilloried by everybody, as far as I can see. But I just wondered if you might just give us a sort of broad view of actually, why did we end up where we ended up? What shaped the ultimate form of Brexit?
Well, I mean, several things. The most important, I think, of which was the fact that the extremes killed the middle. That, you know, the second referendum crowd and the hard Brexit crowd conspired to ensure that anything that smacked of moderation was seen as a betrayal. And they did that very, very effectively indeed. They did it at the indicative votes. They did it during serial parliament negotiations. I think there's loads of other things. I mean, I still maintain to this day that if one of the levers had become Tory leader, things might have gone differently in a kind of only Nixon could go to China. I think a Boris Johnson or a Michael Gove would have found it easier to make compromises that led to a softer Brexit. I also think things would have happened very differently if you'd actually had a full Tory leadership campaign. I think the fact that Theresa May won the Tory leadership campaign without being forced to say anything apart from Brexit means Brexit. That's the only thing she said in the campaign. And because Andrea Leadsom dropped out and it didn't get to hustings and it didn't get to questions, she was never forced to spell out what her vision was. Because I think if she had been forced to spell it out and if she'd won on the back of that, she would have had a legitimacy that she lacked. And she made up for that lack of legitimacy by desperately trying to kowtow out of the European
Wouldn't she have just spelled out the vision, the Nick Timothy vision that she then spelled out at the Tory party conference in that October? Surely, you know, that was her advisor. She wouldn't have had access to the civil service. She wasn't whatever. You know, she wouldn't have had Ivan Rogers bellowing at her, you don't understand that that's taking out the customs union, the single market, whatever, and stuff. So
Possibly. I think the process would have been easier if there'd been a legitimate position held by the Prime Minister, confirmed by her party in government. My hunch is it would have been softer. You're quite right. Had she just listened to Nick Timothy, it would have been exactly the same, and we might have got to where we ended up just a bit quicker.
Okay, well, it could have saved us a bit of time, if nothing else. So what about the sort of big sort of underlying sort of, you know, changes in this? I mean, how has sort of Brexit changed everything? We've ended up, come on to where Boris Johnson and people ended up, but, you know, what does it tell us? You know, you're a political scientist. What does it tell us about the sort of country we are? What does it tell us about the electorate? What's Brexit made us understand that maybe we didn't quite understand before? And has that been a permanent change or a temporary change? We've got lots of people who do work on that.
Well, I mean, there's lots of things.
Europe.
I mean, David Cameron learnt that he could lose as well as win, which I think was a useful lesson for him. We also learned that actually you should be careful about stirring up votes on things that fundamentally reshape our electorate, because one of the things we've been living with since Brexit is the fact that new division in our society, the sort of tribes of Leave and Remain, have fundamentally redrawn our electoral map. And I'm not sure that was something anyone predicted. I'm not sure it was something that certainly the Conservative Party at the time wanted. In political terms, the effects have been huge. And even if you look at the results of the last election, where no one talked about Brexit, if you look at the split between Leavers and Remainers, it's exactly the same split. It's precisely where it was. The thing that's determined our last two elections, to some extent, is which camp was more divided. In 2019, the Leavers united around Boris Johnson and the Remain camp was divided between SNP, Lib Dems and Labour. In 2024, the Leavers were divided between Reform and the Conservatives, and Remainers were relatively united with Labour. But that division is there, and it's still present in our electorate, and I don't think it would take very much to trigger it again.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. But was the last election a sort of Brexit election, or was it a sort of the first post-Brexit election?
It was the first post-Brexit election in the sense that Brexit wasn't an issue. And in that sense, what's really interesting, we had a hiatus in 2017 and 2019 because the steady sort of secular trend in our politics was of fragmentation and decreasing vote share for the Tories and the Labour Party. And we saw that in 2010 to an extent, we saw it again in 2015. The combination of Brexit and the presence of Jeremy Corbyn polarised things around the two-party divide again. But that was just a blip, it turns out. And 2024 takes us straight back to where we left off in 2015, with a more fragmented politics, with the two big parties getting a far lower share of the votes, and with that real fragmentation that makes elections very difficult to call and makes majority government really hard to achieve.
Very interesting, very interesting. What about other sort of institutions? Did sort of, you probably paid more attention to Parliament through this period than you'd ever bothered with before? Did Parliament emerge with its reputation enhanced?
I mean, Parliament was noticed. I mean, one of the sort of facts that always stuck with me was that during the month of January 2019, the ratings for BBC Parliament, not BBC News, but BBC Parliament, for the first and only time were higher than the ratings for MTV. I mean, there was a sort of pantomime that people round the world tuned into. So in that sense, people watched it and people were interested. I don't think the reputation of Parliament necessarily came out of it better than it was before, because Parliament failed to resolve this for so long. I mean, I have to say we had some wonderful moments in Parliament. I mean, there are two moments that stick in my mind. The first was when we were in a room with a bunch of Labour MPs in 2017, and the division bell rang, and they had to go out and vote for the election. And like they just trooped past us with their heads down. And I remember one of them just saying, "Turkey's voting for bloody Christmas," because they all thought they'll lose their seats because of Jeremy Corbyn. And the next thing that really sticks in my mind was with Catherine again. We went in on the day of the indicative votes. A couple of Tories had said, "Could you come in and talk to our MPs about what the indicative votes are, what the choices are?" And we went into a room with about 90 Tory MPs in there. And I remember just being utterly appalled by how little anyone had learnt. So the first question was, but surely a customs union means we have to accept freedom of movement. And you think, we've been doing this for 3 years. And now, on the day when you've got to choose between various alternatives, you're asking questions like that. I thought it was really interesting.
But at least they were asking before they voted that time, rather than...
Yeah, and I probably gave them the wrong answer anyway,
so that's quite useful. Anyway, I could ask you whether... Yeah, I won't bother to go there. So, yeah. What about economics? I mean...
Overrated.
It's a good thing Jonathan Portes isn't here, probably for the second time this evening. I mean, why were economists sort of not listened to? Haven't economists been sort of vindicated?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it's interesting to see whether they were not listened to or whether what they said didn't matter. I think, you think back, we did some work back in 2017 about a group of voters we call comfortable leavers. And for those people, who were the majority of the leave vote, if there's an economic hit, it doesn't matter. I've paid off my mortgage, I've got shares. This is something I can cope with. And the other bunch of people, I mean, there would be a small bunch of people who didn't believe the economics, but another bunch of people who I think, and we've met a lot of those in the north of England pre-referendum, whose view was, whether the Chancellor says the economy is doing well or whether the Chancellor says the economy is doing badly, my life's pretty crap. So actually, at least this way I get to sort of stick it to them and show them that I'm really hacked off, and it won't really, how much worse can things get? So and there was a fatalism, I think, to some of it, which is very, very similar to some of the vox pops you hear about Trump, actually.
That's interesting. So do you think, actually, that people now are thinking, those economists, they had a point?
It's really hard, isn't it? It's a really interesting question, this, the degree to which you can attribute economic outcomes to political origins, because it's very hard now. I mean, I've heard people say, I heard someone say at a question time audience that, well, obviously the fact the economy is doing badly now has got nothing to do with Brexit, because we did that in 2016. And it is really, really difficult, I think, to make the political case that stuff that's impacting on our economy now has something to do with the decision we took back then. And actually, it's one of the reasons I'm very sceptical about a meaningful Remain campaign emerging anytime soon, because making that argument is actually quite tricky.
Okay, another sort of bit of the political landscape that UKIS looked at. We did quite a lot of work on devolution, work on Northern Ireland. I know you said, for God's sake, don't ask me any questions about devolution.
All right.
But I remember after, as we then called them before we were told we couldn't call them that anymore, Beer and Brexit, with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob Rees-Mogg assured me that Brexit would be good for the Union, because it would have no effect in Northern Ireland and would strengthen the union with Scotland. Well, was he right?
Let me trump you with Bernard Jenkin, which is another highlight, where we had a conference on devolution, and Bernard Jenkin, I don't know what position he had at the time, was he chair of the ELG or something? He gave the keynote. Anyway, he gave the keynote in a session that was chaired by Katie Hayward, so they were both sitting in the front.
Katie Hayward
from
Northern Ireland,
who was our Northern Ireland expert. And as ever, when one of our people was in the chair, I was bombarding with WhatsApps to try and put them off. And there was a point at which Bernard Jenkins said, essentially, well, look, I mean, that devolution deal was only temporary anyway, and if England's going to reassert its control over the Union, so much the better. And Katie's jaw muscles worked furiously as she was sitting there. So, I think for some Tories, they just didn't care, to be perfectly honest. Some of them thought this is a good way to wind in some of the excesses that Tony Blair imposed on us. I mean, has it had an impact? Yes, it had a huge impact. It's had a huge impact on Northern Ireland. I mean, the festering legacy of Boris Johnson is the Northern Ireland Protocol and the consent vote, which means that however much Northern Ireland politics grows up and moves beyond sectarianism, every 4 years it's kind of ding ding, let's talk about that again. I mean, it'll have enormous impacts going forward. And similarly, obviously Scottish politics is in a different place now to where it was post-referendum, but it would be naive to argue it hasn't had an impact on the politics. And it's certainly, as you know far better than me, through the workings of things like the Internal Market Act, had a massive impact on the sort of DNA of the country in trade and economic and constitutional terms.
And a couple more sort of institutions throw at you. What about the media? How did you think they acquitted themselves during the sort of long Brexit years? We got to know each other by appearing on various TV outings together.
Yep.
So, which was a clear Brexit benefit, but does the media do a good job?
I mean, God, I have to say, I mean, friendships is one of the big Brexit benefits, actually, the people I've met through it. But the media learnt on the job. The media learnt during the referendum. Different bits of the media were more or less effective. I mean, so take the BBC. My first brush with the BBC, my first real brush with the BBC over Brexit was during the referendum, where they rang me up. I live in Oxford. They rang me up and said, can you come down and do Newsnight tonight? Because we've got some leavers, we've got some remainers, and we'd like you to come and just talk through what they say. I said, absolutely fine. So I was on the train. They rang me just as I got into Slough and said, we're standing you down. Fantastic. So I got off the train at Slough and I said, why? And they said, well, we've decided it's safer to have a leave backing expert and a remain backing expert. And I said, well, that's just undermining. I mean, we had a big fight on the phone about this as being a ridiculous approach to expertise. So that was their starting point, was, have an expert on one side and an expert on the other. And I think they learned and they got better. What I would say about the BBC is I think their weakest outlets were the most publicly visible ones. So I think Today and Newsnight struggled a lot. I think BBC Breakfast and Radio 5 were brilliant from the start because they were far less constrained. They were far less scrutinised, I suspect, by BBC management. And so they had a freedom to go out and try things. I remember one of our then fellows, a law professor at Cardiff called Joe Hunt, went and spent the day in a market in Cardiff with Radio 5 Live, just talking to market traders about what trade is, what Brexit means, what we get from the EU, what we don't. And it was absolutely, the whole day was absolutely fascinating. So I don't think you can sort of blanket say the BBC messed up or the BBC didn't mess up. I think different outlets did it differently. Subsequent to the referendum, I mean, I remember very, very clearly on the 24th of June that a well-known reporter from a major newspaper rang up, sort of as a sort of precursor of things
to come. Customs union?
No, and said, "What is sovereignty?" It's like, I don't bloody know. And, that was almost the start of the whole thing, because reflecting on UK and a changing Europe, as I've done a bit because it's the 10th anniversary, I think we've had some really good people who've done some really good work. There's no getting around that, okay? But the reason we became as successful as we did, because I think we were successful, I'm biased, but anyway, is because this massive vacuum opened up. There were a massive sort of UK and a changing Europe shaped hole opened up in the national debate, because all of a sudden we'd left. No one knew the first thing about what that meant. All the pre-existing think tanks were kind of tarred by their reputation because they were either Eurosceptic or Europhile, so the media kept clear of them. And all of a sudden you get this bunch of nerds who are willing to talk about sovereignty, customs unions, and stuff like that. It kind of... The circumstances were very, very helpful to us, I have to say.
Bonanza for nerds.
Perfect.
But let's talk slightly more. Let's fast forward now. We've talked quite a lot about this. Were you surprised that Boris Johnson and David Frost managed to do that deal in record time against that weird year of 2019, 2020? The Volksfass cutting off Northern Ireland?
I was surprised in the sense that I thought
Boris Johnson was a man of principle.
I thought they wouldn't go ahead with the form of Brexit that they'd propounded because they'd be worried about the immediate economic impacts. As it turned out, and we'll never know the answer to this, did we? The immediate impacts of Brexit were hidden by the onset of COVID. So we don't know.
That is a conspiracy theory in a half hand.
Yeah, COVID started in a Henley lab. So that's one of the great... Because that was the reason why I was surprised. I was surprised because I thought that is such a thin deal. It's going to have immediate economic repercussions, and they're going to be evident quite quickly. And I never thought, A, that you'd have COVID, which would block them out, or B, that a Leave camp that had gone on about taking back control and about the asymmetry of our trade with the European Union would sign a Brexit deal, watch the European Union impose all the checks on their border and make it a free-for-all for importers into our country so that all our exporters were saying, hang on. I'd never expected that to be the outcome of this process.
Do it in one parliamentary term,
Yeah.
so you immediately sort of reap your...
And, I was amazed, though not as appalled as Bridget Fowler was, by the way they rammed the TCA through Parliament in a day and a half. I mean, that was unbelievable.
Yeah, well, maybe that goes a bit to whether Parliament emerged with its reputation enhanced or whatever. It's been quite interesting how willing parliamentarians are just to hand powers to government whenever asked. But anyway, so let's fast forward to now. I've got quite a few questions coming in, but also Anonymous has told me Italy's victory in the 1990 Eurovision Song Contest was with Insieme 1992. You're Italian good enough to know. Does that mean together? I don't know.
He's 1992.
Yeah, thank you.
That's half
By
right.
Toto Cutugno. Anyway, so we know now something about that. But let's fast forward. Keir Starmer, is he getting slightly less reluctant to mention Brexit? Get In, the book by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogren suggests in a tantalising paragraph, which made me lug it to Brussels last week, unless it said more, was that he harbours a secret plan for moving the UK much closer to the EU. Is he right to be so hesitant?
Oh, God.
Do you think he's got a secret plan?
Well, I think it would be absurd if any plans you had in July 2024 remain intact after the year we've lived through, is the first thing I would say. So I think there's a massive opening now. I mean, it's no surprise that Starmer is now talking about building our alliance with Europe, because, of course, everything's dominated by the security dimension and things like that. I suspect that when it comes to the terms of the economic reset, not much will happen beyond the agricultural agreement. And I suspect that partly because Keir Starmer has committed to red lines. And I'm not a great fan of parties promising something in a manifesto and then breaking those promises. So I can see good reasons for them sticking to those. But the other side of that, of course, is the reason why we can't move closer to the European Union short of the single market is I just don't think the European Union is going to give us that sort of alignment deal in other sectors. I mean, Rachel Reeves famously before the election did that FT interview where she said, oh, we could have a bit of alignment on chemicals. And I just don't think the EU will do that.
Okay, so secret plans or not, the EU's going to get in the way?
Yeah, I think both sides, the politics of both sides and the red lines of both sides will make it very, very hard to go much further than the agricultural deal.
Okay, I've got a question from Anonymous. Thanks, Anonymous. Do you think that Europe might consider a two-speed or an inner-outer grouping consisting of, say, pick your countries, UK, Ukraine and Canada? A well-known European country. But if we can join the CPTPP, and pretend we're in the Pacific, why can't Canada join the EU? Or an outer EU?
I mean, I'd say initially because it's not a European country, and as far as I remember the treaties of the European Union, that figures as one of the criteria for membership. I think Ukraine will do something for Ukraine because I'm very, very sceptical as to whether Ukraine will join in the next decade. I mean, even today, if you see the arguments about the economic relationship with Ukraine, some of the East European states are saying we need to keep these controls in place because their Ukrainian products are flooding our market. So I think they will do something very flexible. They've already done something very flexible for Ukraine. They'll do something even more flexible for Ukraine, and the argument will be it's a direction of travel. Ukraine wants to join. You've left, so we're not making any special provisions for you. It's worth bearing in mind that a lot of what the EU does and a lot of what the EU dresses up as principle is politics disguised as principle. That is to say, actually, we don't want to do this with you. We could, if we wanted to, but actually, why should we reward you for leaving? And remember, there's still a thing in some Europe, if you're a European head of state or government facing a threat from a populist right that is saying, either we want to leave the European Union or actually we want the European Union to be a lot weaker. We want it to be a club of sovereign states. We don't want the European Commission telling us what to do. The last thing in the world you'd want to see is a flourishing UK economy outside the European Union, okay, because we'd become a poster boy. And actually, it worked quite well that Brexit was such a mess and we flailed around quite so badly because, of course, what you saw immediately in many European countries, if not all, was support for a membership going up. You saw Marine Le Pen rowing back on earlier promises about leaving the Eurozone, leaving the European Union. So I think there's a politics behind this as well for some member states. And what I don't know yet is the degree to which that politics gets mitigated by the security imperative caused by Trump.
Okay, I was about to ask you that. Doesn't Trump change everything? Let's go to some questions in the room. Murin's got a roving mic. So anyone got any questions? Let us go. Tell us who you are, even if we know who you are.
Catherine, used to work at UKIS, so really pleased to be here. I'm just wondering who your favourite person to interview was during your whole time.
Okay, so I was going to ask you a version of this towards the end, so I'm going to give you two. Who's been your favourite sort of chatter in a Beer and Brexit or an Unlocked? And who do you think is the most interesting person in the Brexit Witness Archive?
Philip Hammond's the most interesting in the Brexit Witness Archive, I think. There's that phrase.
Philip, where we had to come back for seconds.
Yeah, and there's that phrase he says where Theresa May committed a coup against her own cabinet. I remember thinking, blimey, did he really just say that?
Will he leave it in? And he did.
Yeah, in terms of like the in conversations we've done, the best, I mean, this is stalling partly, so I can give you an answer. The best day we had, which was a real lesson in politics, was our annual conference. Can't remember what year it was, but in the morning we had an in conversation with Tony Blair, and in the afternoon we had an in conversation with Nigel Farage. They were both on the same day. And I just remember at the end of the day thinking they were both absolutely brilliant in utterly incomparable ways. I mean, Blair was forensic and he was talking about the details of this bit of legislation or this bit of whatever, and he had a command of the facts. No humour, but very serious and but a good communicator. there wasn't a fact in sight with Farage. You know, he sat there with his Union Jack socks, having a great time, just sort of. But he was superb, and they were both really, really good communicators. And actually, it was a real lesson for me watching them that there's no model of doing this. You can do it in really, really different ways and still be really effective. So that was a fun day. Here,
so how much credit should we give Farage for Brexit? I mean, could he really sort of say, without me, there would be no Brexit?
yeah, absolutely, I think. Absolutely, because he pushed it onto the agenda. Absolutely, because it was Carswell and Reckless who really put... I mean, I know that Cameron had given the go-ahead beforehand, but they changed the dynamic quite significantly. I think Farage helped the Leave campaign rally a bunch of voters who would never have voted for a Boris Johnson or Michael Gove cause. So, yeah, I think he was absolutely central to the enterprise.
Okay. And you were going to go on and say about your most fun...
I can only remember the ones I didn't enjoy at the moment.
Tell us those as well. No.
Liz Truss was difficult. I mean, go on.
I thought she warmed to you after a bit, didn't she?
Yeah, she wasn't like the ones where there's no chemistry at all. I mean, the ones with no chemistry at all are just sort of just a bit, but she just didn't answer the questions in any way, shape or form, and sort of, it was just a really, I found it really confusing. And it was all the worse. I mean, but one of the great fun ones was doing Jacob Rees-Mogg at the peak of his powers at Tory party conference, where the room was packed. I mean, you couldn't move, you couldn't breathe in this room. Okay, and it was superb fun because I'd ask a question and everyone would boo, and he'd give an answer and everyone would cheer, and it was like a 1 hour pantomime. I had an absolute ball. So I think that was the one I've enjoyed most, even though it was a bit silly.
Okay, that's whatever. We've got another question there.
Yeah, Bernard Casey. Just to congratulate you on your 10 years, because I think it was quite an achievement. Normally, projects like this get evaluated at some stage and decisions are made. We know that decisions, or some decisions, have already been made about your future, but I only kind of know what I've read in the newspaper. Can you say about whether there is and how much of a future there might be for UK ICE, but also for groups like this, because it is a bit different to most of the other groups which things like the ESRC have financed, and it does communicate and it does interact in a very, very different way. That is what has been novel about it, and I wondered whether you could say, are there sort of futures not only for you, but futures for things like this within the social science world? Thank you.
I mean, there are definitely futures for things like this inside the social science world, because, of course, the SRC part funds the IFS, and the SRC also fund the Economics Observatory, which is similar. I mean, the IFS, you know, the Economics Observatory is similar. It tries to popularise sort of economic analysis. With us, insofar as I know, the SRC were faced with budgetary uncertainty with the spending review coming up. They'd funded us for 10 years, and they took a decision that I think they found quite difficult to take, that actually, given the lack of clarity about the financial future, they wouldn't be able to fund us going forward. We have, I think I can say this now, we're sort of a dot on the I and a cross on the T short of having secured enough money to keep going for at least another year. So there's another year left in us, and during that year I think we'll evaluate whether A, we can find other sources to fund us, or B, whether after the spending review the SRC will reconsider. I mean, if any of you are or know a billionaire, you can have another drink and then talk to me at the end.
But building on that, because I was going to come to that, but let's do that now. What are you going to do over the next year? What's the future looking like? What have you got in mind? Because one of the odd things about the timing of the funding decision is UK-EU relations sort of like back on the agenda with a vengeance at the moment, and we're all very interesting about the UK in a changing Europe. This title suddenly makes sense, and UK in a changing world. We've been waiting so long, but anyway.
I mean, there's a degree of retrenchment because I have a slightly smaller team, but I think we'll do what is our core business. And actually, what is fantastic, as you say, is our core business is suddenly very, very sexy and relevant again. I mean, whether it's in the security sphere or whether it's the sort of, you know, that triangle US, UK, EU and the choices that we're going to have to make about it, there is so much really interesting stuff going on that's in need of analysis that actually, you know, this might be a little bit Ponglossian of me, but it's almost the best time to be sort of retreating to our core territory in the sense that our core territory is probably as interesting as it's ever been, actually. I mean, I find this period a lot more interesting than I found debates in Parliament, hand on heart, because there are real geopolitical trade-offs and tensions to be looked at. So we'll be going back to focusing mainly on UK and EU relations for the foreseeable future.
I can't believe you didn't find the sort of, rivetingness of the meaningful vote and the Malthouse Compromise and all these things. I mean, yeah.
I didn't understand the Malthouse Compromise then, and I can't remember it now. So,
yeah, I think one of my IFG colleagues suggested that we should make a film of it. But anyway, starring Matt Damon. But anyway, I just want to ask a question that's slightly relevant to this. Patsy McLean has asked, post-Brexit, one of the reactions of politicians to Brexit was, oh, we've got to level up, we've got to do all these things for these left-behind areas that may or may not have hated the EU, but were basically signalling to Westminster we've been forgotten about and we don't like it, and when you give us a chance in a vote that you might notice, we're going to give you a kicking. Are you surprised that seems to have been sort of dropped by... Rachel Reeves was criticised very much earlier in the year for making a growth announcement which basically regarded Oxford as the north and everything was south of there. And the big growth announcement this week is a theme park in Bedfordshire.
So that for me was one of the great positives that came out.
Theme park in Bedfordshire?
Well, Oxford.
Oh.
One of the positives of the referendum was we had that debate about regional inequality. And of course...
We've forgotten it now, then.
Well, I mean, there are several things about it. I mean, one, it obviously should be a priority regardless of the politics, because the reason why our country lacks growth is because of the lack of productivity of second cities in regions like Birmingham or Manchester or wherever. And so it should be a national priority for economic reasons anyway, but it isn't. And one of the things that the referendum did, there's another story I should tell you, is it made those parts of the country that politicians didn't pay enough attention to politically very, very salient. I mean, I remember so let me tell you a tale of two people. In the referendum campaign, we were up in Sunderland, and I remember a woman saying to me, politics is just crap, because let's face it, you could stick a red rosette on a donkey here, and we'd vote for it. You'd vote Labour because that's just what we do. There's no, and even though they keep letting us down, this is what we just sort of keep doing. Fast forward to 2022, and I hate to mention another think tank, I'm at the birthday sort of reception for the Centre for European Reform, and Charles Grant introduces me to the new Japanese ambassador. I think he was new at the time, and his first words to me were, I'm fascinated by what's happening in Wakefield. Right. Now, I'm from Wakefield. No one has ever said that to me in my life, right? No one cares what happens in Wakefield. No one's heard of Wakefield. But it was indicative of the way that Brexit and that sort of redrawing of the political geography of the country that I spoke about earlier meant these places couldn't be ignored anymore. I mean, the best thing you can do if you want politicians to notice you is become a marginal, right? And that's what loads of these places did. And so whilst you're absolutely right, and I've been quite disappointed by the fact that the government hasn't talked more about regional inequality, governments are going to have to pay more attention to those sorts of places than they did in the past, because they are marginals now. No one knows how they're going to vote at the next election. I mean, once the red wall fell, that sort of umbilical cord that tied them to the Labour Party was snapped. And those people now will pick and choose as they please from election to election, and their votes are going to have to be won. So I think even despite the fact that the Tories talked about it and didn't do it, and Labour aren't even talking about it, I'm vaguely optimistic that actually the nature of politics means that there'll be less neglect than there has.
Okay, we've got another question here, Murin. And then over there. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Jukka Suukosaari, Ambassador of Finland. Firstly, congratulations on the 10 years. And secondly, thank you very much for reminding the Toto Cutugno song that I had utterly forgotten. I checked the lyrics, and my first favorite line in the song is actually Per noi amori senza confini. For us, love without borders. So maybe that illustrates the thinking on the continent. And this year, by the way, the Eurovision Song Contest will be won by a song about a Finnish sauna. So that's the Swedish that's the Swedish entry, though.
That's progress.
But my question is completely different. You talked about the economists and perhaps also the business people in before the referendum and how they perhaps didn't be vocal, or they weren't vocal enough in telling what they thought. But wasn't it so that some of them actually thought that the European Union was going to destroy itself anyway, that they were counting on not simply because of Brexit, but because of the impossibility of the integration to succeed? Of course, this was prior to COVID, this was prior to Russia's senseless war of aggression against Ukraine, and then a third external factor that I won't mention. But they didn't see that these external threats would unite Europe the way it did. And do you still sense a sentiment of that type in the UK society, that there are people who think that the European project will ultimately fail?
Okay, I mean, I think in the UK what we don't get and what we've never got is the political overlay of what we see as an economic project. And that's where we've always, and I remember back to the Maastricht debates when people started saying political union, and you could see our politicians going, what? What does that mean? I think there's a very fundamental reason for that, which is that for most member states, European integration is an economic project that is pursued at least in part for an explicitly political reason. So for the six, it was peace. For the Southern Europeans, it was democracy. For the East Europeans, it was the return home. So there was always, they've taken it for granted that behind this integration of markets, there's a greater political narrative. Now, we never had a greater political narrative. So I think we've always been slightly ill at ease because we don't understand it. We don't get it. We've never had that thing. I remember, again, when I was doing my PhD, I had to spend a month or so in Paris reading stuff in the library of the National Assembly, the Parliament. And I was absolutely gobsmacked because every single book in the National Assembly had a sticker on it that said, Mon pays, c'est l'Europe. My country is Europe. I was thinking, weird, because I'm quite British. So I think on an emotional and a practical level, we've never quite understood that. I don't think outside of fringe elements in the Conservative Party, it is a widespread view that the whole thing is going to fall apart. If you want the best views from British business of European integration, there was an exercise carried out under David Cameron called the Balance of Competences Review, which was a weird exercise. And there's lots of interesting stories to tell about it. But the one I will tell is Vodafone provided some written evidence to the Balance of Competence Review about the single market. I have never read a shorter, sweeter, clearer analysis of just what a benefit the single market is to business. I mean, British businesses, particularly big British businesses, really got a lot out of the single market. And I think generally they were cowed by government from speaking out. So pre-referendum, I think a lot of people assumed that Remain would win. So you could, and that would be the ideal, wouldn't it? If you're running a big business, the ideal is I'm not going to criticise members of the governing party, but I'm going to get the results I want. Post-referendum, I mean, I remember having a conversation with the CEO about this, sort of during the dog days of Brexit, about why don't you say something? And he said to me, he said the following. He said, one, if we come out publicly and say, if we get Brexit like that, it's going to be a nightmare, our share price will go down. You know. Two, our customers will start ringing us up saying, oh my God, does this mean you can't complete orders? Our competitors will start ringing those customers saying they're in trouble because of Brexit. So there is no upside to us from talking up the dangers of this. So we kept quiet.
And the government would take very little notice, I think, was the final.
And the government would ban you from future bids and future contracts and whatever.
So I was mentioning our name, which is always a bit difficult when you go on a radio show and they say, that's a very stupid name and things like that. And then you say, you can say I'm from the Institute for Government if you prefer. But anyway, no. But I just wanted to talk about changing Europe.
Richter's smile at that point.
No, Richter's smile. Your Philip Hammond moment. When How is Europe changing? I mean, is Europe now a very different Europe to the one that would have been if that vote had been 52, 48 in the other direction, 2016? Lots of things happened in Europe that the UK would have stopped, slowed down. The frugal 4 would have been a frugal 5. We'd have been a bit more sceptical about things. You know, is Europe now very, very different to a Europe that we would have seen if the UK had stayed a member state?
I mean, yes, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. Europe's a very different place now because of COVID and because Europe's at war. Right. I mean, we aren't the major factor behind the way Europe... I mean, I think it's absolutely the case that in the years after we left, the European Union did stuff we would have tried to stop. We'd have tried to stop the building of a defence HQ. We'd have tried to stop the Commission having a role in defence. We'd have tried to stop the COVID recovery fund being designed in the way it was designed. Absolutely, we would have done. But I think, you know, the fact that Europe has changed so fundamentally is down to factors that have nothing whatsoever to do with us, but to do with sort of external events. Can I just say, I mean, I feel I ought to sort of do this now. The name is crap. And the reason the name is crap, and this is how it happened, okay? I was at a meeting in Swindon with the ASRC where they just said, oh, we're going to increase your budget from £50,000 to £4.5 million because there's going to be a referendum and you've got to hire a team and you've got to have a website and all this sort of stuff. And I was just sitting there going, oh my God. And I had a train that I had to catch in 10 minutes' time. And they said, before you go, literally, they said, before you go, we need a name. And so we've got a crap name, and I'm really sorry, but that's how it happened. And actually, my argument for our name now is that it's a brand, not a name, so we're not changing it.
Okay.
I mean, there was another train in half an hour, actually. In retrospect, I should have got the next train. You're absolutely right. But
I thought you just got someone to, you know, make it up in a pub quiz, but yeah, that's a different joke.
Yeah.
But anyway, we've got a question over there. Will.
Well pitched on the communications topic, actually. I was interested that you made a comparison between UK and a Changing Europe and IFS, a think tank I respect hugely, and others. And it seemed to me that it undersold something that's very special about UK and a Changing Europe. You know, you're happy chatting with ambassadors and CEOs. You're also happy doing pantomime on the beach with Jacob Rees-Mogg at a party conference and running around the country doing public events. There's a very two-way quality to UK and a Changing Europe's communication, which has been a big group achievement by everybody in the team that I think you can be really proud of. But it's very, very rare in the communication of research and the communication of evidence. And it's in contrast to the boss of IFS after the referendum who wrote about the failure of his profession, economists, to communicate effectively with the public. So I wondered if you wanted to reflect on why is that two-way communication where you listen as much as you talk both so rare and so powerful?
well, I mean, there's several things. I mean, firstly, what I would say is I think our way of doing things came from, initially, from an inferiority complex in the sense that you were up against IFS, or these buggers at IFG, you know, with their fancy buildings and their massive resources, and like, well, there's us stuck in an office full of mice, sort of trying to compete. And so I very quickly said, we're going to do this as plucky outsiders. Okay, we're going to be the insurgents here. We're going to do things that's light-hearted. And I should say, in parentheses, not everyone likes our style. The number of email complaints we got in the years after the referendum about the facetious tone of our newsletter, about, you know, you really should not be making jokes about issues like this. Well, you'd get like 30, 40 emails. Yeah. So not everyone liked it. But I think one of the things that shaped us when it came to the listening stuff was those early interactions with the public. And I think they were absolutely fundamental to how I understood this job, because our early events weren't us turning up and speaking. They were us turning up and answering questions. There was always that moment at the events where you thought, what if there are no questions? This could be really embarrassing. But I think that set the stage for what we did, because we've never, and one of the funny things about us is we don't have an agenda. I mean, we have a methodological agenda, which is to make sure people know what the best research says, but we don't have a substantive agenda in any way, shape or form. And I think that means you almost have to listen. You have to figure out what people's priorities are, what people want to know about, because we're not trying to persuade people to do anything on A, B, and C. It was really, really kind of you to say what you said, but I think, as with so much of what we did, it was something we fell into and it worked. I'd love to be able to take credit and say it was all. I sat down and wrote a master plan, and it was more just something that happened because of the way things happened, and it seems to have worked.
So Anand, you did this after years, very distinguished years in academia, writing books and things like that. So what, looking back over the last 10 years, are the big lessons that you've taken out about academics who want to influence, engage with the public, see their research talked about, inform public debate?
God, that's hard. I really struggled at academia, and actually, I was never bright enough to be a theorist or patient enough to be an empiricist. But I sort of blagged a bit of both in my career, which makes me ideal for this job because I've got the attention span of a gnat, and this is just the perfect job for me. I mean, my days are spent doing 20 minutes of this, 20 minutes of that, and I just find it a far better natural fit than academia. So that's me. With academics in general, it's not compulsory that you have to do the outside stuff. It's partly just a question of temperament. I happen to think that if you're a social scientist, you should communicate the results of what you're finding out about society, partly because you're publicly funded, partly because you have a responsibility to do so. I mean, it'd be absurd if you were a medical scientist and you discovered a cure for a disease and you didn't tell anyone. I mean, it's like you should go out there and tell people what your findings are. Now, I don't think that should be imposed on all academics. There are a few academics I strongly encourage not to try. But no, there are loads of academics who do it really well, and I think the fundamental problem is structural in academia, is if you think about the top universities and careers in academia, there is only one thing you have to do to be successful, which is to publish articles in the top journals, okay? And that's it. It's not a question of your teaching, it's not a question of if you're on the telly. In fact, if you're a junior academic, it can actively hurt you to do the sort of stuff we do because you're taking time away from when you should be writing those journal articles. We've had, and one of the things I'm proudest about us as an organisation is over the 10 years, we've had loads of people in our research team who have all just been fantastic. And by the time they've left, they've been confident, they've been brilliant at writing, they've got a media profile. The couple of them who toyed with the idea of an academic career failed to get one because they were told, well, you haven't written articles that no one's read. What's all this farting around writing for The Guardian? Who cares about that? And I think, actually, there is a fundamental incentive problem. Sorry, I realise it's turned into a sermon. But there is a fundamental incentive problem inside universities, and I don't think this sort of stuff is valued as much as it should be in the system of academia.
Okay, very, very interesting. Has it sort of made you
Might need a new job if anyone's hiring.
Has it made you reappraise anything, role of civil servants, think tanks, anything like that? You've had far more contact with them, presumably, over the last 10 years. Journalists who have to churn out stories every day. Yeah,
I mean, I've a lot of admiration for journalists, how they do what they do, how they did what they did now with 24-hour news. And, if you work for someone like The Guardian, you don't just write your piece, then go home. You write another one and another one because it's 24 hours. I've really enjoyed working with journalists. I think, have I changed I mean, I wish I'd done this earlier. I wish I'd been aware of this world and sort of engaged with it earlier, but I'm not sure anything. I mean, I think I'm more appreciative of how difficult governing is now than I was as just a political scientist who watched, sort of talking to politicians and engaging with civil servants, the starkness of some of the trade-offs, the long-termness of some of the things you want to try and accomplish. I think governing is incredibly difficult, and the utter mismatch between the language of elections and the reality of governing is appalling.
Very important lesson anyway. Final couple of questions from Slido, and then...
Aperol.
Then not quite yet.
Okay.
What have you learned about the EU that you didn't know before? And probably the same anonymous, what have you been surprised about the UK with respect to the EU? If you were rewriting...
I've been surprised, like many people were, by just how deeply the tentacles of membership encroached on our country. And of course, the only way you find that out is by leaving. And just the sheer scale of the task of leaving, and the things you had to unplug, and the things you had to do differently, and the things you'd never really... I remember, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, I had a coffee with David Lidington when he was leader of the House of Commons. And so we was having a perfectly nice chat. David's a really nice bloke, and he was always willing to give us time. And in the corner, he has a sumptuous office if you're leader of the House of Commons, and in the corner of it, he had this little whiteboard with a list of things. And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, God, that's stuff that people keep remembering we need to do now we've left the European Union that we'd forgotten. Like we have no legislation to allow us to do sanctions on a country because it was all done through the EU, and we'd forgotten that we have to pass some legislation, otherwise we can't sanction Russia because we've got no..." And just that was such an interesting example of the EU sort of, as was it Douglas Hurd says, the EU inveigles itself into every nook and cranny of national life. And actually the degree to which that was true really took me by surprise. I was surprised that the EU remained as united during the Brexit talks. In retrospect, I shouldn't have been, because if you think it through, it's hard to imagine. But at the time, I was genuinely surprised by that.
And also, as united now, we see that we've got Kaja Kallas expressing a bit of surprise that fish might get in the way of a defence pact at the May 19th summit.
The EU's always messy. It's always been messy. I mean, the wonder about the EU is it somehow keeps going and strengthening despite that. But, for as long as there's been a European Union, there's been national politics that gets in the way of stuff. When I used to lecture this sort of thing, I used to be fond of pointing out to the French that the only country that actually tried to make the whole thing grind to a halt for a year was actually France, not the United Kingdom, in 1965. But somehow it keeps going.
During non-cooperation over BSE, that was...
Yeah. And, I mean, with the Kaja Kallas stuff, that happens all the time. And I remember... Javier Solana getting told off for saying stuff that wasn't scripted in advance by member states. But in a way, that's the tension of the European Union, isn't it? We want a spokesperson to talk about foreign policy on our behalf until they say something we don't like, in which case we remind them of the prerogatives of nation states. And that tension is always going to be there, I think. I don't think it means the European Union is doomed. I think it always means the European Union is always going to be slightly less effective than the sheer economic weight of its member states imply that it should be.
Okay, and a final question, and then I've got a special treat. Will the UK be a member of the customs union or the single market in 10 years' time? Probability.
Customs union, possibly, yeah.
Okay,
Not this-
probability out of 100?
That involves knowing what happens at the next election, doesn't it? I mean, that's what I would say, is I think it is perfectly conceivable that Labour lose their majority at the next election, which is what makes me doubt this. If Labour are in power, I'd say it's probably 60, 65, 70%.
Okay, customs union, single market? No. Okay, that's things. Anand.
And actually, it's worth adding on this that there is an issue with the single market if you're an economy like the UK's and a country like the UK, because we have a big, complicated economy, a lot bigger and a lot more complicated than, say, the Norwegian economy. And if your economy is relatively straightforward and the major parts of it are sort of slightly outside the ambit of EU law, that's one thing. Us being in the single market means allowing the European Union to pass financial services legislation that, A, isn't designed for our country, so won't have the needs of the city at heart, and B, that the French will enjoy doing just out of spite, I suspect, So I think there are real political issues about single market membership. And if you think that we had a referendum in 2016 where the central issue about leaving was control, the idea that you'd go from the supposed lack of control of membership to the utter lack of control of single market membership without EU membership, that would just be farcical, to be honest.
Okay, that's enough EU Brexit. Now, we're not allowed to call this an unlocked because we were slightly worried that if we did that, people might think they've saved the best to last, and this is going to be the last ever unlocked, and it's definitely not going to be. There are going to be more unlocks. But one of the things you always do in unlocked is you put people under rapid fire, and your team have got together to compile some questions. Unfortunately, I've left them in my bag, so I've had to reinvent them and slightly garble them, but whatever. So, Wakefield or Oxford?
Wakefield. Well, for what?
For anything. You never get people. Anyway, okay, moving on. Greg's sausage roll or Dishoom breakfast bacon naan?
Breakfast bacon naan.
Breakfast bacon naan. Virat Kohli or Billy Bremner? For those of you that don't know, Anand did Billy Bremner as his great life, but Virat Kohli's alive and therefore disqualified.
Billy Bremner, actually.
Oh.
I know.
Oh.
I know.
Australia versus England at cricket.
Australia, every bloody time.
Okay. Deportation is... No. Institute for Government or Institute for Fiscal Studies?
Jesus.
I would point out no one from the IFS is in the audience tonight.
I would point out that Paul has got a cold or he would have come. I'll say IFS just because we're all here. All right.
Lawyers or economists?
Jesus Christ. Devil in the deep blue sea. Economists.
Okay. McSweeney or Cummings?
Cummings.
Okay. Looking forward. Master of Oxford College or member of the House of Lords?
Both.
Okay, so cakeism is still alive, at least in the mind of Professor Anand Menon. Anand, it's been a great last 10 years. Thank you very much for letting me work with you, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. It was very stressful.